Okay, hello everyone. Our topic is dynamic domains as a territorial impact of human emergence in Antarctica. Just let me take a breath. So this is in collaboration with Polar Lab. They're celebrating the 200th anniversary of discovery of Antarctica in 2020. Looking at the historical human emergence in Antarctic system, it was mainly to fish around the continent. And initially they started with sealing, to an extent that the seals went almost extinct in 30 to 40 years. After which they switched to whaling, and which went on for decades as well. And the numbers fell from 300,000 to 2,000. So clearly the idea of Antarctica being pristine might not be true after all. So looking at what are the global commons, the UN describes global commons as resources which lie beyond national sovereignty. So the international law recognizes four global commons: outer space, atmosphere, high seas, and Antarctica. Of course, we're going to be talking about Antarctica today. Originally, there were 7 claimant countries which laid claims to a slice of Antarctica. By these 7 countries, and US and USSR reserved their rights to claim in future. But due to multifaceted geopolitical tension, an Antarctic treaty system was established in 1959. This image is the first Antarctic Treaty meeting in Australia in 1961. And today there are 54 members within the ATS, 29 consultative members, which are shown in the red, and the rest are non-consultative members. And mapping out the human emergence itself, if we looked at Antarctica in 1980, we would see research facilities and bases distributed throughout the continent, but mostly in the peninsula because of ease of accessibility and better weather conditions. And more recently, what we know as CAMLR was established. CAMLR is an organization known as Convention of Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So the gray hatch all around the continent represents that, and the organization basically regulates the marine resources around the Antarctic system. And further, CAMLR was also responsible for establishing a marine protected area over here, which means that no sort of resource can be extracted from this region. And further, they also propose another marine protected area in the Weddell Sea, which is still under discussion. And there have been campaigns done by Greenpeace, for example, which want to world park Antarctica free from any sort of resource extraction. But of course, the proposal for Weddell Sea was rejected for the 8th consecutive time in this year's meeting in November in Australia. And the group says that Russia, China, and Norway played a part in rejecting a plan. But we often forget that such sensitive settings are attached to very complex planetary processes. For instance, Antarctica is a rather dynamic continent. It's always pulsating. The sea ice around the continent keeps shifting according to different seasons and different months. Whereas the blue pigment that you see around the continent represents the chlorophyll, which is secreted by this keystone species, which is known as phytoplankton. So phytoplankton is responsible for absorption of carbon. It absorbs almost 60% of global atmospheric carbon, and so does it in Antarctica. Once it absorbs carbon, it buries itself to the seabed, and over thousands of years of pressurization of that sequestered carbon, it turns into fossil fuel, and this process is known as biopump. But of course, this fossil fuel is being burned by humans today. As a result, there is excessive carbon in the atmosphere, and this excessive carbon acidifies the ocean, which in turn reduces the nutrients available for a species like phytoplankton to exist. And if you look at the trophic web of the Antarctic system, we notice that phytoplankton is at the base of it, and therefore, of course, it's a keystone species where all the other species directly or indirectly depend on it. And then we looked at the resource that is being extracted the most today in Antarctica, which is Antarctic krill. It's also known as Euphausia superba. It has possibly the highest biomass throughout any species in the planet. And looking back at the trophic web, it itself is a keystone species which directly feeds upon phytoplankton, whereas all the other predator species somehow also feed upon the krill. So again, a pivotal species. It has its own behavioral patterns. For example, the young krill, they take shelter beneath the sea ice and also graze upon the phytoplankton that is attached underneath it. That's the winter condition. Whereas in the spring, the sea ice dissolves a lot of nutrients into the ocean, which results in a phytoplankton bloom. And as a result, all the krill, they gather around that bloom to feed upon it. And finally, in the summer, the female krill, they travel to the deep ocean, they reproduce, and the embryo hatches itself and starts swimming back towards the continental shelf just before the winter starts again. And this cycle keeps on continuing. The act of krill fishing itself is done through these massive floating industries. This is probably one of the oldest krill fishing vessels that is deployed by Aker Biomarine, a krill fishing company from Norway. It's been deployed since 1970, known as Saga Sea. Whereas modern technologies have allowed companies like Aker Biomarine to put in state-of-the-art facilities in the Antarctic waters to fish krill. This is Antarctic Endurance, probably the latest krill fishing vessel. The process of extracting krill itself is not that complicated, where huge trawls, which are sometimes even bigger than the vessel, they capture these swarms of krill, which are then transferred to the vessel through a pressurized hose. And once the krill is on the board, it has to be processed immediately because it's a perishable item and it self-destructs itself. So essentially, you don't really need a terrestrial infrastructure for such an industry. This is a catalog of all the 11 krill fishing vessels that are deployed in today's state. They're deployed by these 5 countries that are listed over here. Interesting thing is to see that all these countries are consultative members within the ATS. But the issue really is this, where we looked at the krill catch history in the last recorded 40 years by Kamlar. And we saw that almost all of the krill that has been caught in the last 20 to 30 years has been done within Area 48, which is one of the sectors of Kamlar. And then we looked at Area 48 and the history of catch of Area 48. We realized that more than half of it is further concentrated into a very small sector, which is 48.1. So of course, we can imagine that the issue isn't really the catch of krill itself, but the concentration of it, which puts the system next to it and the predator species under severe stress. This is a zoom in of Area 48.1, and we can see how these krill fishing vessels hover between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula region. And the important gateways of the krill fishing industries are Cape Town, Punta Arenas, and Montevideo, Uruguay. These are 3 gateways that facilitates the whole industry. And talking about the industry itself, as mentioned before, Norway probably extracts the most out of all the 5 countries, as they extracted more than 160,000 tons last year itself. And therefore, we tracked the global network of a particular company, Aker Biomarine, which we also mentioned before. They basically produce 3 products: human supplement, aquaculture feed, and pet food. So we unfolded the whole network of these products. Of course, the krill is caught from a Kamlar regulated sector in 48.1, where the krill is extracted by the company Aker Biomarine through, let's say, Saga Sea. Once it's extracted, they have a logistical hub in Montevideo where they put in all the products. From there, the batch of human supplement is sent directly to Houston, USA, where it's further processed in its manufacturing unit, whereas all the other krill product is sold to a company called Biomar in Denmark as a raw ingredient. So Biomar is the company which produces the aquaculture feed after it takes the krill product from Aker Biomarine. And once it has made the aquaculture feed, it further sells its aquaculture feed to a salmon producing company called Scottish Sea Farms, which is based in Scotland. This is a company which raises salmon by feeding in the krill diet. And finally, the Scottish Sea Farms sell their salmon to Marks and Spencer. So what that means is that the salmon that we get next door is coming, it has a footprint in the Antarctic waters. So of course, such a global network is a hidden disaster which is being continued for a very long time. And our position is that such issues and such networks they continue to exist because of how we manage our commons and how we trap our commons within these static man-made boundaries, and how these resources are somehow not, how the sensitivity of these resources are not catered to. So therefore, we looked at a few case studies of how to manage these resources throughout the world. The first one that we looked at was St. Lucia. The idea of protecting the west coast of St. Lucia was to protect certain patches of corals, but least they expect was that the fisheries next to these protected corals would benefit from these protected areas as the yield started growing. Therefore, it was clear that if you place fisheries next to a protected area, the fisheries benefit as well as protecting the sensitive part of the ecosystem. The next study was the EcoCast in the west coast of USA, where it's a data predictive habitat modeling. You can choose a target species, and the data processing can tell you where to best fish these target species without actually fishing the non-target species. So it predicts according to the data it captures. And finally, the proposal of real-time incentive tariff-based system in Ireland. In this system, each fisherman is given 200 RTIs to spend, along with a weekly map of this grid, which tells you which box has what RTI value attached to it. So basically, each fisherman has its own freedom to spend its RTIs and fish accordingly. And then probably Daniel can talk about the proposal.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the proposal, which has three different parts. First, we're going to talk about the territorial management we propose, and then how we can apply dynamic fishing management onto the top of it. So it's important to mention that how we understand the boundaries itself, that considering the spatial extent, we take the natural boundaries into account, which incorporates dynamic oceanographic systems like the sea ice and the phytoplankton. And also we need to mention the circumpolar current which circulates around Antarctica, which makes basically Antarctica keeps frozen. Within these boundaries, we can establish exclusive zones based on different trophic parameters like spawning areas and feeding grounds of the krill. And as well, we take the predator colonies into account whilst we processing. And then the idea is to track and protect the productive part of the krill. So first, we need to check where the krill coming from the deep ocean, where it goes towards the Bransfield Strait around the peninsula, where basically other predators as well are feeding upon the krill, and also the fishing activities also operating. So we might get the idea that how this environment could be stressed. But how the data is processed and what kind of data we process. So we identify the excessive domains of phytoplankton using the Arcomodis satellite data sets, 8 days intervals, what we can see over here in motion. And we compute the derivative change of these chlorophyll samples in order to identify the derivative change. What we use to produce a map like this, where we basically calculate the change of the gradients in the positive direction, because we are interested in the positive change, which is shown in the circles, and we can get the vector fields as well. So we can establish exclusive zones on feeding grounds of the krill, which change over time, in weeks in particular. And the rest of the areas can be utilized by the fisheries, expecting an increase of the krill biomass. And I'm going to turn to the dynamic resource management, where we have two main variables in space and in time. First, we establishing these isodensity domains based on the datascape what we had before. We call it isodensity domains, and then we call it isochrones in later on, and which basically account for outlining our environmental sensitivity based on those factors. But how we do it is these isodensity domains are constructed by evaluating them and setting a threshold in order to only include those higher values into account which are relevant for us. And then we formulate radial shapes that we can call isochrones. How it looks like on the map after we get the datascape from the analysis. So we can presume the probability of the krill habitat derived from the mentioned datasets, and we apply density domains on the top of that, and we classify them from 1 to 4, which will be important where we set up the fishing management itself. And this shifts weekly. So the other part of our resource management is the incentive credit system, where we consider the time as a basic unit. So we can have an exchange rate that the fisheries have to deal with those units which are based on time. But first we assign vessel fields for each vessel based on the capacity that it can hold. So bigger the capacity of the vessels, the bigger the vessel field. And it will be important because these vessel fields will be overlapped with each other or with isochrones. And with respect to this, they need to span units, the temporal based units from their budget. So how it works exactly? If in the case of Sargassy, which gets 300 units per season, let's say, and once it's activated by harvesting activity, a certain number of units will be reduced with respect to the domain it operates in. Now it's in this X3 zone, so 3 units will be reduced, and then 4, 3 again, and it continues daily. So the idea is to maintain the catch per unit effort, which means the harvesting effort plus the probability of the catch. Therefore, the export zones gives less time to catch the same amount of krill than in the X1 or others. So this works as an incentive to them when they're hovering around exclusive zones, but not to spend too much time in sensitive domains. This is the catalog, how it looks like, all of the authorized vessels which operating around Antarctica. We can see the big differences along Norwegian vessels. They are the biggest and the most efficient ones. And the idea is that how these vessel fields interact with isodensity domains first, and which resulted in maintaining catch per unit effort, plus establishing the incentive credit system with the exchange rate, makes the whole approach of ours as isochronal fishing management. So this we can call isochrones at this point. So the fleet is deployed on the Brensel Strait, and then the various vessels are hovering around these domains, and their available units will be reduced according to their vessel fields overlap with the sensitive zones, or like for example here with the export zone, or with each other, taking the Antarctic Endurance as an example with another vessel. And meanwhile, the trawling, the fishing pressure also shown over here, according to the harvesting efficiency and the zone sensitivity they operate in, which aims to avoid concentrated fishing. So therefore, I'm unfolding the global network of the industry itself. We can see and we can study how our tool, how it can cause a consequence for the whole global industry to the end user, which we can assume that this approach helps providing distinctive packaging to the end user, giving exact information about the location where that particular product was coming from. And then, not only in the Antarctica, but it is important to mention how our tool can react to a global scale. And this is how the current ocean management looks like with the boundaries of statistical fishing zones regulated by the FAO. And but we can ask a question that this is the approach that we can maintain in the sense that all of the high seas is meant to be global common in a particular setting which circulating around, naming the thermohaline circulation, what we can see over here, which is an example which is circulating from northern oceans to the southern oceans. And this is really important because this giant current slowly mixing the water vertically itself as well. And this is what we can call global conveyor, in which different upwelling systems brings the nutrient-rich waters onto the top surface to help the phytoplankton and other organisms be alive. And so we looked at the global ocean productivity through the following parameters: the rate of the photosynthesis, the chlorophyll, and the autotrophic respiration, which is what we can call net primary production. And following the solar cycle, we can see how it's fluctuating by the seasons we have. And through this, we are able to map the health of the global ocean systems, which broadly constitutes various environmental drivers such as light, nutrients, and temperature. And these are influenced by oceanographic and atmospheric processes such as currents or upwelling system here in Western Africa, or El Nino current system stretches through the Pacific. Therefore, we use the ocean productivity as a proxy to study the dynamics of the oceans, as it quantifies the health of it. And this is, we took the two extremes. This is the January situation of the primary production, and the next is the other one in July, where we wanted to make a gradient change in between the two extremes in order to identify the most dynamic systems. And it is an obvious observation that these systems, which are the most dynamic, also the most sensitive. Take an example of the polar systems, which basically fluctuate more than the equator systems. The global community, including UK, propose a future where at least 30% of oceans should be protected. And this is the Greenpeace's proposal. But we can raise the question that this is an adequate management and the way how we can deal with the high seas as global commons. So idea here is to see how R2 can react for the decades to come. Using the prediction of ocean productivity, here the graph says that if the following trend continues, it will be declined by 90%, and in the case of RCP 8.5. What is RCP 8.5? Which basically representative concentration pathway, which basically measures the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So we take the worst case scenario where when we want to map the ocean productivity in order to identify and setting dynamic regulation systems. Using IPCC socioeconomic scenarios where we can have different angles in a globalized world where the economic values are high, we can expect more extractivist activities in a more interconnected world. So we visualize this gradient change, what we had on the graph of the ocean productivity between 1920 and 2080 under the RCP 8.5, which enables us to see the most sensitive systems in our planet. This visualization shows to what extent the ocean productivity will change the most, for example, along the Pacific or the polar systems. So we can identify the most dynamic systems to be regulated instead of managing the commons in a static manner. Thank you.
Try to think of questions, things you haven't covered. Yeah, thank you so much.
Can I just say, having seen your presentation earlier this year, it's fascinating to see where you've taken it, because it felt like the project was quite complete in the summer, and now you've embraced the challenge of cracking it open and sort of engaging with other challenges. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do when partway through the academic year you've got something which is so well rounded off. So well done with that. I don't have any particular questions, to be perfectly honest. I sort of there's some areas where I made more sense of, let's say, the direction you're going, and other areas where I was thinking, oh, it's kind of maybe it's still left quite unresolved. But maybe as an initial question, could you state what your main let's say ambition is for this as a project, for which you presented a certain...
I guess how we could frame it is that it essentially is how do you manage resources from a common, which is supposed to be catered to the whole community, but some national forces have influence on it. So how can you manage it like in a very dynamic way, considering the dynamic situations in this environment, instead of just like protecting it or taking out the resource? So that was the main idea.
So there wasn't an ambition there to limit the use of the resources. It was more about actually how it's divided and distributed and
Yeah.
I mean, the argument, like the current argument, is that you can either protect a resource or you can extract it. But there can be another situation where you can regulate it in a way which is more dynamic and is in sync with the processes that are attached to it.
And one idea to add to it, which has to be, or in our position, it has to be responsive in a way that we could see how global oceans or whatever basically on the Earth is managed within these static boundaries. And we take those organisms and processes into account, and which basically helps to protect in real time, day by day, as a response to the environment. Maybe.
Ed's question is an interesting one, and I think it would help to follow it right the way through to help to clarify your ultimate goals. Because the question of krill, we are introducing ourselves as a species, as a predator into a system where we have not existed as a predator before. So we're competing with other natural predators in this system. And when you look at the use of krill for something like pet food, and you say, is this ethical for us to compete with, whales just so we can feed Fluffy? There's a serious problem there. So it could very well be helpful for you to say, actually the ultimate goal might have to be, how do we either A, stop hunting krill, because fishing is hunting. We tend to think of it as just gathering, but it really is going out and killing something from the wild. It's one of the few food sources that we have that's still just basically hunting. So if we get rid of krill, that's one set of questions. Like, does that mean that we need to start eating more freshwater fish that's farmed on land? Or the other question might be, how do we use krill but introduce ourselves as a beneficial part of that process as well, so that we're actually, for every pound of krill we extract, there's a pound of gain that we leave behind, so that there's a balancing there. That might be the ultimate question that you're...
First, like in the case of Antarctica, it's a question that how a company which runs krill harvesting and production can be profitable in the other side of the world from Norway. And and these stages about how the industry goes on is we had a lot of time to think of how we can contribute to the chain at some point. And this is how I ended up showing this thing with packaging, because at least the whole industry is transparent because of the nature of the krill fishing. And so we'll know exact locations of exact coordinates where it comes from. And this is why we ended up doing this. But it's a question of how, if we extract something, how we can put it back in another point. Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
And to answer to your question, since we are assigning like sensitivity zones to different areas, so X4 becomes the most sensitive zone, and then these companies would be asked to pay more to fish in that zone, whereas you're also protecting that particular area, which means that the productive part of the krill cycle remains in a way intact, whereas you can fish in all the other regions by paying lesser amount of incentives. So that is how we try to tackle this situation, by just instead of just like uprooting the whole industry and saying that you cannot use krill.
I think it's an amazing piece of work, so well done. My question is, like, if you step back from this now and kind of look at what you thought you would be doing in an architecture school and what you have done, where do you think this is going to lead your careers? I mean, what's the impact going to be on your careers? I don't know if you've asked yourself those questions.
Like design thinking for me is like in an architecture school is to how we can depict different interrelations which basically drawing, animation, or whatever visualization we make, how we can correlate different things. And of course, it has not only architecture but other fields that we have to get involved, from biology to oceanography to climate and to politics and everything. But how we can depict these correlations. For me, this is the design thinking of it.
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know about what kind of career possibilities that are there, but of course, what I definitely know is that there is this school of thought which becomes the fundamental thought for everything you do, be it development, be it making a house in a very small plot. But you're conscious about the fact that the project that you're doing has a huge network behind it that needs to be unfolded. And if you're conscious about that network, then irrespective of the scale of project that you're doing, you somehow try to bend it in a way that aligns with this thought. Yeah.
I want to say thank you for the presentation. It was beautifully illustrated, because it's a subject I don't know much about. It's not really my own knowledge, and much in the headlines that you showed, I don't know much more than that. And especially the diagrams of krill under the moving ice sheets was really helpful and great. Two things. One, that great example you just gave might lead you as an architect to say, we don't need to build this building.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have that conversation with the client about well, I've unfolded everything behind here and this is terrible sustainably. Which is really good. It's important because that's a time of breakdown, and architects declare when those conversations need to be had. So that's good, thinking of that. Similarly, this might, as ice melts and things move, you might have the question to tell, we can only actually have 3 of these boats now. So there needs to be a place where this is not just displaying stuff, but it needs to sort of maybe be as a tool for interfering with politics as well as just explaining systems. But as a dynamic process, my main question is, it's a really beautifully illustrated and intelligent way of mapping what used to be 3-dimensional territories into the moving systems. Have you explored or thought about ways it could be applied to other species or other types of commons, even social or human or urban commons, rather than just geographical?
I wouldn't say that we have, but we definitely are aware of other types of commons which are not listed by the UN. So, for example, the radio frequencies or these sort of I don't know how they.
Or like the cyber, or
when where each of the companies are allotted a particular segment of the frequency, and these becomes a common as well because this has to be distributed among the community. But as far as the project is concerned, I wouldn't say that we have tried the tool.
I'm not saying you should. You've got 2 weeks. I'm not saying you should do that. But it'd be really interesting to even have a bit in there to say this is a model and it's great for krill, but the world in 100 years is not going to be built, but there will be.
Makes sense.
So actually, it's great to know you're thinking of it, but also be nice to introduce that tangentially.
Yeah. And also the idea that now that we have these systems identified, then possibly each of these systems can be regulated on a regional scale in whatever way it is. But somehow this tool is also telling you the most dynamic systems that are present globally. So that is how we try to conclude the project.
Could I just question that a little bit? I mean, you seem to have been looking primarily at the ocean and its dynamics, which obviously interact with atmospheric dynamics, which I don't think you've represented in this model. Is that true?
It is.
I mean, it's incredibly complicated, but it
Yeah.
seemed as I was looking at it from our work, the sort of atmospheric dynamics that go hand in hand with these oceanic dynamics do complicate this picture a little bit.
We can say, for example, currents are induced by winds, but of course we haven't explored that how far the atmospheric processes are we have to take into account. So they're way more difficult to
visualize.
Since we're taking NPP as the proxy to look at global commons, So we would imagine that the primary productivity of oceans would interact with the atmospheric conditions as well. So now, like, we haven't taken atmosphere directly, but we are taking NPP as a proxy of the productivity of the whole system. So
I don't know what the other critics think, but the one gap that I felt is once you move from the krill to like wider oceanic systems, there seemed to be a little bit of a gap in the argument there for me. I mean, I can follow it, but possibly you just need to kind of outline the objectives that you have in doing this.
I would agree, Lindsay. That's certainly one of the areas where I felt like I was less equipped, intellectually less equipped to kind of follow you as you made that
leap.
Well, I mean, one of the gifts that you can give other scholars and researchers too is to say where the gaps are. If you know where the gaps are, identify them, and you say, you know, this is missing from this analysis, and it could be a goal to. I think that the questions have pointed to something that's really important, that's underlying your work, and that's that you have combined a very critical process. You've been extremely open to looking at the interaction of a lot of different variables. You know, there's stuff missing, but you've been able to tell very compelling stories using visual information. And I'm convinced that if we're going to sell people on the idea of a planetary commons, and if we are going to protect that commons, and if we're going to protect our planetary future, we've got to develop modes of storytelling exactly like this. So I would encourage you, for the future of your work, you know, to avoid dogma in many of the ways that you already have, and which you could expand upon by maybe saying what the end argument might be. Like, krill fishing is bad, we need an end to krill fishing, here's how we phase it out. And perhaps to think about where your work fits in policy development. You know, I think these tools would be very useful to Greenpeace. Or this is speaking about economics. You know, this is emplacing economics, which we have to do. Again, if we're going to survive as a species, we've got to realize that economics is something that happens in places, and is very helpful for that too.
When I say you guys presented before, I know I brought up the idea of these real-time incentives, so thank you for clearly following through with that. That's nice to see. And as I think you know, like, these real-time incentives aren't used anywhere yet. Researchers are proposing this in Europe, but that's not currently how we manage it. A ton is a ton. You take a ton of cod out of the ocean, doesn't matter where in that zone it comes from. So this idea of exchange rates is something new. Why is Antarctica the best place to try out this new method? So if it hasn't been tried anywhere else, why Antarctica? And I can think of a reason why it shouldn't be, which is that it requires a lot of data, and I'm guessing, I don't know much about Antarctica, I'm guessing we don't have the knowledge about the Antarctica ecosystem as we do about the North Sea, because we've been fish stock assessments there for hundreds of years. And that's one question. The other thing is about the dynamicism, and one of the big questions in fisheries management is how you do fair initial allocations. So if you say, from now on, you can only fish 1,000 tons of cod. Okay, so who gets those 1,000 tons? And usually it just works on what you've been doing in the past. If some guy was fishing 5%, then he gets 5% going forwards. And I think you're doing something similar here, but I just want to make that explicit, because there's something about, like, the footprint of each vessel. And because that vessel is larger, it should get a larger amount of these credits. And of course, that's a huge value judgment there. So, like, can we just pause for a moment on that one and think about that, and how would you approach that in a more dynamic manner? Because it seems like it's dynamic within the day-to-day fishing operations, but how do you deal with dynamicism in that a new country comes along and says, well, we want a fishing fleet too. we've entered a new stage of development. We'd like some krill, but suddenly it's the countries that have been powers for the last 50 years that are fishing the krill. So what does dynamicism mean at that larger level?
I think that's a really good point, and there's a number of let's say additions, I think, in regards to questioning the data that you collect or that's put in front of you, and whether those are the allocations or whether that's just sort of either issues of waste or questions of, let's say, geopolitics, which maybe are difficult to pause on when you're going through a project so quickly as a student. But maybe, I wonder, over the next 6 months, once you graduate, you think, actually, here's a paper I want to write about all those strange things, which contradictions, which maybe have been glossed over in this sort of maybe more balanced equilibrium of processes that you presented. Because I think there are weird things, I think, that go on underneath these more perfected processes. And I think what one certainly is that balance, sort of allocation.
So just your first question, what we think is the Antarctica is supposed to be a good place for trying this real incentive or an incentive credit system is because, it's true that of course we don't know as much about Antarctica as many other part of the Earth, but because it's a global common, all of the data is public, and we also could collect many kind of data what we could not for particular countries because it's their interest. So even though, of course, and of course from the 50s, only science operating down there, and since for this reason, and to add to the fact that Antarctica is inherently a dynamic system, and as well the Arctic. So these poles are allows us to think as dynamic in when we apply a fishing management itself. Justice.
Yes, just quick follow-up. Do you think this type of real-time credit system should be used everywhere? Or is it like Antarctica is just your case study, or is it the best example? Is it just an example, or is it the best example?
I don't find a best example, but I found it relevant. On the Antarctic, we can use a kind of credit system like this. Otherwise, we stick to the static boundaries, what they use right now. And so this could be a relevant solution from our understanding.
I think maybe also answering to your question, because we hadn't posed this question and we hadn't discussed this issue, but I think one of the reasons why Antarctica might be a relevant place is that at the moment there are territorial claims. But the boundaries are not fixed, because of the treaty, they were left open, let's say. So this is why the incentive system allows us to think borders differently, and that's perhaps something related to the commons, as Daniel was saying, and perhaps relating to your comments is a way of reclaiming commons, and to perhaps thinking about how you could reclaim commons in the city as well, and how you could do that through time. Currently, it's impossible to do it in the fixed boundaries, but perhaps models like this, or ways of thinking in this way, through Antarctica and the RTI system, can be a way of reclaiming commons in a different way, through more dynamic, or through not static boundaries.
Yeah, I think for us it's also, these two last projects, I'm saying last because we presented the message in September. Well, this one is the most complicated one. It's literally uncharted territories for us. Like when they started doing the project and we accept the proposition that they were in the polar depth, we literally didn't know that we were ending up with this sort of project. So I mean, for us, it's actually, I mean, it's been an interesting sort of journey to understand perhaps other ways of practices that a profession can perhaps entail. And to me, is this idea of revealing processes through these methods of visualization are very crucial, especially in this moment where not only local but global or planetary processes are at stake. And I think that's perhaps the most relevant contribution. Obviously, the topic in itself is far too complicated for us, and it goes beyond any expertise we might be able to give, in terms of fisheries or in terms of even management system in that specific topic, which thankfully, we have some support from the New Economics Foundation and the guys over there to help them produce. But I think management system also, or the idea of producing some sort of design management system is something that I think for us is very crucial. I mean, I think both projects in a way they try to see whether successfully or not our relationship between society and nature, and we need to somehow regulate that relation and produce different ways of relate to nature. So we can perhaps think about different ways of producing futures, and that's something that to me is crucial, and that's perhaps something that we're trying to embrace in the program, to understand certain type of policies, which in the end are regulations or ways to manage relation to nature and how we visualize them. And hopefully then this can help us to relate to other professions, to other disciplines, and and establish wider conversations to see whether the skills that we produce here, I mean, as an architectural school, is not only buildings. I mean, buildings might be one important aspect that history has been built upon, but there are other design ways that produces a space, and that's something that I think they've been doing successfully. Obviously, as I said, like the specific aspects we don't even know how to assess. In general, I think for us it's been kind of interesting, following and learning how they kind of and disentangle all the information they've been giving.
Can I raise a slight word of caution, and I don't really know how to say this. The kind of idea that the future can be managed and regulated into existence seems to underpin a lot of this work. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I just wanted to flag it up because there are other ways of conceptualizing how the future can be brought about that maybe need to prick this a little bit. Like, you know what I'm saying? That there seems to be underlying the work this belief that management and regulation are good and that they're the key to the future. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I just think we need
to add to that, I would say that a better understanding of the historic function of the commons and the ways in which the commons is negotiated, and it's not a simple matter that it's all horizontally organized. You've got the church and the state and the landlord and everyone else who's involved in the commons historically. But I think there are models at the local level for negotiating the commons, and also at the planetary level looking at ideas of federalism, for example, as models for negotiated workings of the commons rather than regulated. So the idea that compliance and control isn't the goal, but rather a platform.
Thank you.